Welcome to Gaslit Nation. I am your host, Andrea Chalupa, writer and the writer, screenwriter, producer of the upcoming journalistic thriller, Mr. Jones.
I am Sarah Genzier. I'm a journalist, a scholar of authoritarian states focusing on the former Soviet Union, and the author of the essay collection, The View from Flyover Country.
And we're very excited to announce the Get Ungaslit reading series, which will be running over the summer. This includes really interesting interviews with authors such as Malcolm Nance, who wrote The Plot to Hack America, How Putin's Cyber Spies and WikiLeaks Try to Steal the 2016 Election, as well as The Plot to Destroy Democracy, How Putin and his spies are undermining America and dismantling the West. We also talked to Vanity Fair contributing editor Craig Unger, author of House of Trump, House of Putin, The Untold Story of Donald Trump and the Russian Mafia. And we speak to Olga Lotman, an independent researcher and expert on the Russian Mafia who helped Unger with his book. And we speak with the Washington Post's Greg Sargent, author of the Plumlines blog, who wrote An Uncivil War, Taking Back Our Democracy in an Age of Trumpian Disinformation and Thunderdome Politics. And we speak with Crystal Marie Fleming, who wrote How to Be Less Stupid About Race. So our summer is lined up with a lot of really interesting interviews, which will help defend all of us going into the 2020 election. So we look forward to sharing that with you. So Sarah, what is going on? Speaking of the 2020 election, how is the latest with the Paul Manafort of the 2020 election, who looks to be Rudy Giuliani, filling that role?
Yeah, I mean, well, first we should say later in this episode, we're going to be airing the second half of Andrea's interview with Russian-American journalist Vlad Davidson, who talked all about Giuliani's activity in our episode from a couple weeks ago called Dirty, Dirty Giuliani, I believe it was. And Dirty, Dirty Giuliani is just the gift that keeps on taking from American democracy. Today is June 7th. The Daily Beast has announced that...
Today's June 9th.
Oh, today's June 9th. This is where we are. Okay, let me start over.
We haven't slept in like 2 days, so we're stuck in June 7th. But yeah, it is June 9th.
We've been recording this summer series. It's that good. It'll knock you unconscious and unable to tell time.
It'll freeze time.
Anyway, 2 days ago, the Democrats announced that they are actively discussing opening a probe into Giuliani for his, quote, overseas political and consulting work, basically his dirty deeds, which doesn't just include his work in Ukraine, but also in Romania, in Armenia, and in the many other countries where he's replaced Manafort as this kind of go-to guy, this nexus between the GOP, various mafia entities, and various foreign governments, in which he ties them together. And you know, I don't know if the Democrats are actually going to move forward on this, but I thought it was notable because, of course, Giuliani, like William Barr, is another one of these Republicans either in or connected to the Trump administration that seems to actively want to push the idea of show trials. You know, we have gotten to the point a couple months after the Mueller probe has ended, well over 2 years into the Trump administration, where they can no longer distance themselves from Russia. They gave up on that long ago. They've instead decided to flip the script, to investigate the investigators, to take the people who were advocating for justice and rule of law and accuse them of subverting it. And so we're at this point where unless the Democrats and other members of Congress do their actual job, it's going to be impeachment hearings or it's going to be show trials. So I'm glad to see that there's at least a semblance of a pulse among the Democrats in terms of investigating people who are obviously overt bad actors. You know, as Andrea said in the previous episode about Giuliani, this is someone who should have registered as a foreign agent. This is someone who has been linked to anti-American activity, you know, in a way for a long time. Basically, after the point he became America's mayor, quote unquote, he went in the opposite direction.
More like Moscow's mayor.
Yeah, pretty much.
Or Kherson, Ukraine's mayor, because he worked with the mobbed up mayor of that city in Ukraine for a while.
Well, what are your thoughts on this?
My thoughts on this is yes, absolutely. Like as anybody that's investigated Giuliani's many Kremlin-linked ties and his ties to weird, bad foreign actors generally, he absolutely should be registered as a foreign agent. And the fact that he's walking around and not having some big DOJ investigation into his work abroad, into his clientele, some which work against American interests clearly. Well, certainly not the interests of Donald Trump, because he's all linked up with Kremlin interests at the moment, and has been for decades. If you listen to our interview with Craig Unger, which is coming up, it's just clear that Reality Winner is in prison for being a whistleblower and alerting the public about election hacking, while Rudy Giuliani parades around collecting money with all these foreign clients and not registering for FARA. So it's the justice system that we have in the world today. Yeah, no, it's frustrating. And this Daily Beast article is interesting because they quote Giuliani speaking himself about the prospect of being investigated. I think that this is about his Armenian activity. He says, "I hope they do investigate me for that, because I would resist and go on a rampage. I'll tell them I won't comply with a subpoena or any request unless you investigate Biden first." And so, the Democrats need to grasp that this is the mentality that they're contending with. We keep hearing all these things about people's reputation, or what will the history books say, or what about posterity? I mean, that is out the window. This particular band of Republicans is living entirely for the present. They are living for power, for money, for territory, and for themselves. They are confident enough that they either will be writing the history books themselves, or that there is no future to speak of, whether it's because of obliteration through climate change and denial of resources, or something worse they have in mind. I can't get out of my head that our foreign policy is dominated by Donald Trump and John Bolton, these nuke fetishists. So obviously my mind goes there. But I hope people grasp the immediacy of the situation. We're not, and haven't been in a long time, in a situation where we can sit around and wait for elections, wait for 2020, wait for non-existent superheroes to step in and fix our problems. That was the mistake that people made in 2016. Since that time, Andrea and I have been just, begging people to grasp this change in mentality, and to some extent to throw their own kind of hangups about, reputation and what will history say and protocol even out the window. And by that, I don't mean be immoral. I don't mean be brutal. I don't mean emulate the Republicans in the sense of their worst behavior. But I mean, throw away the egotism that surrounds matters of reputation and politics, and simply act on principle. Act in accordance to rule of law to help the people that you are supposed to protect and serve. It's just been a very frustrating year, especially since the Democrats took the House, and we expected that there would be accountability. We expected that there would be some change. And instead, we're just seeing a culture of timidity, of prestige politics, of party bias, whereas we have a nonpartisan national security crisis, a constitutional crisis. And I don't know, man. As I said before, I'm a broken record, but better than a broken country. But I don't know if you want to comment on that, especially kind of leading into the conditions that created what you discussed with Vlad in the interview that is coming up. Yeah, so we're running to this week part 2 of my interview with Vlad Davidson, the editor-in-chief of the literary magazine, the Odessa Review, and a columnist for Tablet Magazine. Vlad is someone who follows Jewish issues very closely on the ground in Ukraine, which is a important topic because the Kremlin for decades has tried to weaponize Jewish-Ukrainian relations to try to divide those communities and try to paint Ukraine as a neo-Nazi, broken country and very chaotic. And so Vlad goes into fact-checking the Kremlin's propaganda on that, as well as going into Jewish and Ukrainian history as well, which is, of course, significant for many reasons. And if you look at World War II history, as we have been all month in June 2019, with the 75th anniversary of D-Day, out of all of World War II, Ukraine and Belarus suffered some of the greatest casualties of World War II, lost the largest amount of people in both the war and, of course, the Holocaust combined. And this was a part of Europe that historian Timothy Snyder calls the Bloodlands in his must-read book, Bloodlands, Europe between Hitler and Stalin, all about how those two mass murderers essentially influenced each other over many years. And that's vital reading. And so Vlad talks about all the great progress Ukraine has made, especially in recent years, with bringing greater healing and awareness to Ukraine's own crimes against Jewish communities, and also fact-checking, as I said, the Kremlin's propaganda there that's aggressive and ongoing. We start off the discussion with a look at Obama's foreign policy, which is a topic we've covered quite a bit here. And just to summarize, the point Sarah and I have always made is sort of, as well-intentioned as Obama's foreign policy may have been, things like the Iran deal spread his foreign policy team way too thin, where, for instance, the Iran deal, which was an agreement to try to stop Tehran from making a nuclear weapon in exchange for lifting sanctions. And that's, of course, a wonderful, noble project. But the reality at the time was that Iran getting a nuclear bomb overnight certainly wasn't going to happen. It wasn't an imminent threat, whereas Kremlin aggression was an imminent threat. And I know from talking to someone high up in the Obama administration at the time, the Middle East was the number one priority for his foreign policy team, as it had to be because Bush started that horrible war in Iraq and, of course, Afghanistan, and that really forced Obama to clean up a lot and manage a lot. And then, of course, you had Syria. But at the same time, this person serving in Obama's White House said, Russia's probably third on our list of priorities. Well, you're number one on Russia's list of priorities. Kremlin aggression didn't just happen in 2015, 2016, leading up to the election of Donald Trump. It was plaguing Russia's neighbors for several years. Georgia was invaded. Ukraine, of course, was invaded. You had an Estonian security agent that was kidnapped and held as a political prisoner. And we can go on and on with the whole Kremlin bots and the Internet Research Agency. That was all up and running for several years. And they're doing all types of test runs to infiltrate democracies and influence elections and so forth. And so they were well practiced by the time that they attacked our own election. And Ukrainians who were on the front lines of the Kremlin's aggression for many years tried to warn us, and they sounded like alarmists. And I was watching all this, and I was watching a lot of the hipster nihilists in the media sort of snickering at that. And we should have listened to the Ukrainian alarmists a lot sooner, because, as we always say on the show, Ukraine is a laboratory for Kremlin aggression. And what we have now in Ukraine is a new untested president who promised the people change. He's promised to fight corruption. He promised to essentially bring an end to the war with Russia. And so the danger there is and this new guy, Zelensky, who we talk about in this interview, because Vlad spent about an hour with him on the campaign trail interviewing him and getting to know him. Zelensky has put together an administration that includes and just people around him that include a number of former advisors to Yanukovych, Putin's puppet that was overthrown in the Ukrainian Revolution, as well as some other troubling old guards coming back into the mix. So a lot of sort of nefarious actors have been showing up to Kiev now that Zelensky is in power, thinking that they might get a shot in the power grab that always goes on when there's a changing of the guard. So that's a troubling sign, but we'll see how that all shakes out. It's still early, of course, but I would want to just sort of caution everyone that if Zelensky thinks he can bring an end to war with Russia, Putin is a terrible negotiator because he simply does not compromise. He wants all of it. He pushes the deal as far as it can go. If you look at what happened with Assad, the U.S. wanted Assad to go. No way. Putin made sure Assad stayed, and he stayed. And now the Kremlin has a puppet state in Syria, right on the Mediterranean, which is basically essentially a Kremlin base right on the Mediterranean. And so all of this is to say that if there is any sort of peace deal that Ukraine thinks it can work out with Russia to try to end this war, it's going to be a Trojan horse, and Russia's just going to push deeper as it always does. And there's always a risk that Ukraine falls, and then you have a very large country that is in the Kremlin's hands right on NATO's border, and that could ramp up aggression against NATO countries like Poland and the Baltics and so forth. So what we're saying is we keep talking about Ukraine because it's an important country for us to learn from, to listen to, because it's on the front lines of Kremlin aggression, and what happens there tends to be tested out and comes to Europe's, the EU countries and the US and so forth. So it's in our best interest to pay attention to what happens there and to follow it and understand it and look for any warning signs that pop up wherever we may live. It's a very interesting time, critical time in global affairs and sort of the changing winds of it.
Hey, Gaslit Nation ladies and general fans of bras. Today we're talking about Third Love, a great company that makes bra shopping convenient for you. We at Gaslit Nation know you have too much going on, what with the kleptocratic assault on our rights and freedoms, to want to spend a lot of your time shopping for bras. Thanks to Third Love, you can get your bra shopping done online fast and battle the regime in style. Using Third Love's online Fit Finder quiz, you can order your bras and try them on at home. Third Love uses data points generated by millions of women who've taken their Fit Finder quiz to design bras for a perfect fit and premium feel. Over 12 million women have taken the quiz to date. You just answer a few simple questions to find your perfect fit in 60 seconds. Third Love offers a 100% fit guarantee in 78 sizes. Every customer has 60 days to wear it, wash it, and put it to the test. If you don't love it, you can return it, and Third Love will wash it and donate it to a woman in need. Third Love's team of expert fit stylists are available every day to help via text, chat, or phone. Returns and exchanges are free and easy. Third Love knows there's a perfect bra for everyone, so right now they're offering our listeners 15% off your first order. Go to thirdlove.com/gaslit now to find your perfect fitting bra and get 15% off your first purchase. That's thirdlove.com/gaslit for 15% off today.
And now here is part 2 of our interview with the Russian Jewish American journalist Vlad Davidson on that 2020 battleground state, Ukraine. We recorded this interview in New York in early May in the historic Ukrainian East Village restaurant, where the great filmmaker Sidney Lumet used to rehearse his films.
Those of us who work on Ukraine, such as myself, were very critical of the Obama administration in 2014 for JCPOA.
The Iran deal.
The Iran deal, yeah. The Iran deal had the unfortunate side effect of tying the hands of the Obama administration because they needed the Russians' cooperation in Syria and with the Iran deal, with negotiations with the Iranians, diplomacy. It tied their hands, some of us think, like myself, I think that, on being able to do very much about Crimea and the Donbass in early 2014.
Since after Trump's election, I've always said when everything is said and done, we will look back on this and everything will come back to the Iran deal. And that is because when you have an emergent imperialistic Kremlin coming at you and invading its neighbors, you need to prioritize that and not stretch yourself so thin and working on a largely symbolic Iran deal, which is even questionable in terms of the benefits it would give the Iran regime and how it could potentially embolden Iran, which is one of the largest state sponsors of terrorism in the world.
You certainly don't sound like you worked in the Obama administration.
Well, there's a lot of us who supported him and appreciated a lot of his domestic policies that were absolutely appalled by how he dropped the ball on his foreign policy and didn't prioritize. His priorities were wrong, given that you were dealing with a imperialistic Kremlin that was determined and using asymmetrical warfare, which is relatively cheap to undermine democracies across Europe and ultimately our democracy. When Donald Trump is president of the United States with the help of Kremlin interference, something's wrong with your foreign policy. I'll
freely admit that I did vote for President Obama in 2012, and I would also second that I didn't get the foreign policy I expected, and certainly if I'd known about the JCPOA, I probably would not have given my vote to him in 2012. And I think he did accidentally, without intending to, did break the international alliance system. And in one way or another, obviously President Trump is a blowback in many ways to things that happened, good or bad, during the Obama administration. The foreign policy that Obama administration pursued, the Trump vote was a rebuke to that. Whatever else it was also many other things, but it certainly was a rebuke to that.
I think the Trump winning the election was just showing a lot of institutional failure that was taken advantage of and just showing how the U.S. government, for many years, not just under Obama, just wasn't ready for the challenges of the 21st century. And again, I think it just comes back to the fact that when you have a Kremlin that invades Georgia invades Ukraine, seizes Crimea, and is running 21st century level aggressive propaganda that's working. Because I've spent, like you, in focusing on Ukraine for all these years, I've spent years fact-checking highly intelligent people who are getting their news from RT, Russia Today, and sources on the left that are falling for things like RT. It's effective.
On the margins, it certainly is effective, yeah.
But even in the mainstream, I mean, when Russia's invasion escalated in the spring of 2014, you had credible media outlets from the Atlantic to the New York Times debating the giant far-right monster of Euromaidan and really sort of painting Euromaidan, Ukraine's uprising, as this far-right neo-Nazi-led movement. And it wasn't until the election that followed and the two far-right candidates got barely 2% or something, when the numbers, the voting spoke for itself, when people realized, oh wait, maybe that was...
Yeah. Well, I mean, in any situation where men stand up and fight against riot forces, there'll be a lot of guys who are sporty and are angry and lift weights all the time, and that it doesn't mean it's a neo-Nazi thing. Certainly not. There certainly were right-wingers and conservatives and traditionalists. There's certainly some neo-Nazis in the Maidan, but it was a million people at certain points, 1.5 million people at certain points in the Maidan Square. It was a massive popular revolt against corruption. I mean, that there were also leftists there, and it's true that the Ukrainian ultra-right has almost no electoral success whatsoever. They've not been able to enter parliament since 2014, any large numbers. I mean, one or two right-wing characters, one individual mandate districts on their own charisma, but the parties have not been able to reach the 5% threshold to get a party list into parliament. So less than 5% of the population by far hold ultra-right-wing views, more like 1 or 2%. And frankly, as American citizens, you and I know that it's much more here than 2%.
We have the far right controlling the Senate, the Supreme Court, and the White House. I always say that...
I wouldn't go that far, but there's a lot more ultra-right-wingers in America than there are in Ukraine, for sure.
Well, I always say that I rather have Ukraine's far-right problems than America's.
That surely I agree on.
So tell us, what is the far-right problem in Ukraine? Put it into proper perspective for us.
I mean, in 2014, the Ukrainians had no army. They had no army whatsoever, and they were being invaded, and the state was on...
Yanukovych has basically decimated the military, along with stealing billions from the government.
Well, he was the fifth president in a row to do that. It wasn't just him. It had been policy for 25 years to not have army spending and to have the army be totally subservient to men who often held Russian passports and were educated in Russian military academies. I mean, Ukraine literally had a defense minister who held a Russian passport. That's really weird, wouldn't you say?
Right, that was under Yanukovych.
Yeah, and probably other defense ministers had Russian passports we don't know about. So there was a situation where you needed volunteers to go and fight the Russian army, the regular Russian army. So any man and many women who could hold a gun went up there. And in that situation, you'll take anybody who is willing to fight. And so a lot of these volunteer battalions, they had some right-wingers in them, and some of them, like Azov, were founded by neo-Nazis and later became just really nationalist and were integrated into the Interior Ministry later on. There certainly is a problem with those kinds of figures running around. But for the most part, these battalions are now under the control of the Interior Ministry. Mr. Avakov, weirdly enough, an ethnic Armenian, the Interior Minister is an ethnic Armenian born in Azerbaijan and Baku, controls all these battalions, and his guys are in charge of all these battalions. And they're under the control of an Armenian Interior Minister who is a very close ally of the Jewish president. So these groups are under control. There was no anti-Semitism whatsoever during the election process. In fact, Avakov used them against the sitting president. So are they a threat? Are they a threat to Roma in the country and Jewish people? Possibly. There's not been an anti-Semitic physical hate crime in Ukraine in 2.5 years. There's not been one attack on a Jewish person or a person of Jewish descent in 2.5 years physically. These right-wing battalions are under control of the government, and there are all sorts of little groupsicles which are being continuously infiltrated by both Russian intelligence agents and Ukrainian intelligence agents to keep track of them. The Russians try to make them do bad things in order to make Ukraine look bad, so it has no Western allies, as it should have Western allies, and the Ukrainian intelligence agents infiltrate their guys in there to keep them under control. But the important thing to remember is if there was no Russian invasion, there would have been no guys with big biceps and black t-shirts running around in the first place. This is what happens when your country is invaded and a chunk of your territory is stolen, and 13,000 Ukrainian citizens are murdered by invading Russian forces and their local collaborators.
The far right did disrupt an LGBT rights march in Kiev, and they also attacked a Canadian journalist who was covering it.
Michael Colbron, my colleague. And also they have killed Roma people in the last 2 years, and I've written about this. This is horrible, and no one should say it doesn't happen. They are absolutely a problem, but they are the same kind of problem as they are in Poland and in Hungary and Slovakia, right? And they don't have access to state power. We should absolutely not whitewash anything and not say that there's no problem in Ukraine with this. It's kind of an issue, but it's certainly not a huge issue as it's made out to be in pro-Russian propaganda press. And Ukrainians are very tolerant and accepting people.
I grew up in a very patriotic Ukrainian household in a small Northern California town. We had Ukrainian embroidered pillows and Ukrainian Easter eggs. And
your father's a fantastic man. Say hello to me, yeah?
I will, for sure. My dad, who's from Lviv, from the western part of the city, Catholic. My mom is from Donbass, the Orthodox East. My parents have, of course, what Ukrainians call a mixed marriage. And so growing up with them, my parents just happened to have a lot of Jewish friends. And so I always felt culturally as one with Jewish culture. And we have really good friends from Tel Aviv, for instance, and I learned how to dive for the first time in a public pool in Tel Aviv. And so it wasn't until I got to Ukraine years later, and I lived there for like half a year in 2005, and I brought with me the book by the American author Jonathan Safran Foer, Everything is Illuminated, and he had a reference to anti-Semitism and violence by Ukrainians against Jewish Ukrainians and that whole history. It wasn't until I was much older that I learned about all these issues. For me, I always felt culturally right at home with Jewish culture, and there was this whole sort of Eastern European melting pot that my parents instilled in me.
Well, that's great. That's a very American thing also. You're a good American in that way. To a great extent, people in the diaspora live with stereotypes. And the worst of what happened in the old world, I suppose, they don't remember the good things, and 80 years later, your descendants only remember the bad things. There are absolutely stereotypes in the Ukrainian community about Jews in the diaspora, and there are absolutely stereotypes in the Jewish community in the diaspora about Ukrainians, and my own diaspora, the Russian and the Russian Jewish community in the diaspora about Ukrainians. But the biggest problem between the two diasporas in North America since World War II, the affair of John Demjanjuk, so-called Ivan the Terrible, this is not something that any Jewish Ukrainian or ethnic Ukrainian in Ukraine thinks about. This is entirely a diaspora thing. I've tried to talk to people about that in Ukraine, and actually no one really knows the details of that. Isn't that amazing?
Yeah, so what you're saying is what I've observed as well, where there's a divide between how people who are descendants of Ukraine and Russia, and of course Jewish descendants as well, have a much more sort of divided attitude versus what the reality on the ground in Ukraine itself, where it is more blended and multicultural.
More everyday oriented. I mean,
right. Yeah. But a lot of the Kremlin's sort of framing on all of this, the reality is just simply not on the ground in Ukraine to the extent that the Kremlin wants you to think it is. So when I was living in Ukraine back in 2005 and I started studying the history of Jewish and Ukrainian history, because I was like, I couldn't believe this. I felt so culturally blended. And I actually had Ukrainian and Ukrainian Jewish friends like just shrugging it off and like it's not a big deal. It's like, what's the big deal? We're all one.
Yeah, it's not something that people think about on an everyday level when they're just dealing with ordinary reality or work and taking the kids to school back in the old country. It's something that is mobilized and actually has been mobilized since the Soviet times. You could say, and with good evidence, if you make a good case for it, and I think a lot of people have, that the John Demjanjuk affair was the greatest victory of a Soviet intelligence operation or active measures operation on Ukrainian-Jewish relations and on Ukrainians in the diaspora in the last 70 years, right?
Right, so the Kremlin pushes this narrative to divide.
And it has since like the 50s, and this is not a new thing. This is straight up Cold War tactics that have just been reactivated since 2014. This is something that they've really perfected and have used before, and it just really works. So this is why it's so important, the work that you do.
Thank you very much. And could you explain what the Demyanjuk affair was?
Yeah, very briefly, a thumbnote sketch. A Ukrainian gentleman who lived through the Holodomor and was pressed into the Red Army and was taken prisoner by the Nazis and wound up being a prison camp guard in one of the prisons and wound up going after the war to America and lived his life as an American and had his citizenship stripped by the Americans and deported to Israel. There was a mistrial, and then he was deported to Germany, and he died in Germany after getting his citizenship stripped again. It's this epic case of just an ordinary Ukrainian boy, literally a boy who survived the Holodomor, who survived the war, who survived the Red Army, who survived being a POW, who was pressed into service in the Nazi concentration camps, who came to America to make a new life, was pulled back into the old world. This epic life, which you could read about, there are multiple books about it, but it is this tremendous case where everyone projected the worst of what happened to them during World War II onto his life, onto his case. It divided Ukrainians and Jews for a very long time, and we're still living with the consequences of that case and the political outcomes of the trauma of that case. I think since he died a few years ago, this case will recede into the past, and Ukrainians and Jews and Ukrainian Jews and Ukrainians can build a better relationship.
In his defense was, like, he argued that it was mistaken identity, that he wasn't Ivan the Terrible from the camp, right? That's what I recall.
Yeah, it's a very complex case of mistaken identity, of lost files, of different people projecting their vision of what happened during the Second World War, what happened to their people from the other side onto him. And he was in many ways a blank case, a blank canvas.
Timothy Snyder, the historian at Yale who wrote Bloodlands, Europe Between Hitler and Stalin, Ukraine was central in that. Ukraine, along with Belarus, had the greatest loss of life in World War II. Yeah. Of course, that included suffering greatly in the Holocaust. 1.45 million Jews that perished in Ukraine alone in the Holocaust.
And 5 million Ukrainians, yeah.
And there are several million Ukrainians who were killed by Stalin in the genocide famine in the Holodomor. Yeah. So Ukraine, over just a period of 15 years, had several million people killed like cruelly years, yeah. and deliberately.
It became a kill zone in Eastern Europe, yeah. That's a remarkable book. Professor Snyder has always been very kind and nice to me. Everyone should read that book. He's a great historian.
He's the historical advisor on my film, Mr. Jones, by Agnieszka Holland. So with all of that said, it's amazing the trauma that these people have endured and their descendants still live with. It gets passed through the family, these horrendous stories. Yeah. We're actually doing okay in terms of healing. We could always do better, but it's just what these people went through just to suffer, even continue suffering under a Kremlin that has brought back Stalin and glorified Stalin. I mean, that's just further victimization of Stalin's victims. People cannot understand all these issues that you and I are talking about without understanding the history, the very complex history, and just taking an attitude of accepting that this was trauma on a massive, unprecedented scale. Yep. And there's a lot of healing and a lot of...
We live with that trauma and its consequences to this very day. Every day. In Ukraine, in the diaspora, in my diaspora, in your diaspora, we live with that trauma every day, and it's visited upon everybody to this day, and it will be decades of work, which the Ukrainians and the Ukrainian Jews are doing, which the Russians are not. In fact, what they're doing is
the opposite.
The opposite. They're going back to valorizing these horrible people.
That's psychological torture.
It's self-torture, it's masochism at the very least, you know. It precludes their capacity to build a liberal democratic polity.
A nation that knows its past protects its future.
Yeah, I mean, the Russians will not be able to build a liberal democratic future until they deal with their Stalin worship and they deal with what Russians did to themselves, to each other, and to lots of other people around them, what the Soviet Union did. And I say this as a Russian American, what the Soviets did to themselves and to the constituent people of the Soviet Union, to slave peoples, nations within the Soviet Union who didn't want to be there, who had been captured and held at gunpoint, to the people in the Warsaw Pact. This is a thing that the Russian people will have to deal with, and they're not under the current administration in the Kremlin.
And that's going to have psychological damages for that country for generations to come, because what you're doing is you're further victimizing the victims. It's gaslighting on a massive scale.
And also, it encourages belligerence, and encourages invading your neighbors.
Brutality, invasion, colonization. What the Soviet Union was just another name for the Russian Empire.
It was certainly a continuation of the Russian Empire, and the Russians were, de facto. I mean, a lot of people will argue with this, but the Russians were the titular people of the Soviet Union.
It didn't mean that Russians themselves certainly did not suffer. I mean, they lost some of their greatest thinkers, artists, scientists, so forth in the Great Terror. And to this day, you have a historian of the Great Terror who was thrown into jail on trumped-up pedophilia charges.
What a horrible case that is. Oh, my God. I don't even want to talk about it. Let's talk about Mr. Zelensky.
Okay, back to your friend, Mr. Zelensky.
I wouldn't call him my friend just yet. But
I know you, and you're working on that. I'm just kidding.
never believe a politician when he tells you he's your friend, first of all. In this business or in any other, politicians are not your friends. He is the president-elect of Ukraine. I did spend time with him. He is now the legally, democratically chosen president of Ukraine. I wish him the best. I wish him well. I hope he succeeds. I hope he is the greatest president of Ukraine ever, not just because he's a Jewish comedian and I find him very funny and he's a lot of fun, but because that is good for everybody if he succeeds in making into a corruption-free, liberal, democratic polity and a place for all its citizens, right? I hope he does well. I spent some time with him. I had both good and bad impressions of him. Probably has a short temper. He has a short fuse. That's the worst I can say about him. He's very inexperienced. It's going to be a very steep learning curve. He's going to make a lot of mistakes. He is a very, very, very canny, cunning, tough opponent. Very tough opponent. The Russians are a nuclear-armed state with a military budget, I think 18 to 20 times bigger of Ukrainians, 10 times the manpower in the army, better technology, a more professional political and diplomatic class. The Ukrainians have an extremely tough opponent.
What gave you the impression that he has a short fuse?
He's very suave. He's a lot of fun, by the way. He's very charismatic, very funny. He's very macho in this swaggering macho way. He's a lot of fun. He's very much a man's man, very male. His swaggering jokes. He's into camaraderie, male camaraderie.
The more you describe him, the more I'm imagining the American comedian Kevin Hart.
I don't know who Kevin Hart is. Maybe I spend more time in Paris and Kiev than I should, but he's not a very big guy. He's a little guy.
Yeah, this is Kevin Hart. He's like the white Ukrainian Kevin Hart.
Really? Could be. He's a slim, slight guy with tremendous shoulders because he works out and lifts every single day. Huge shoulders, wears tight black t-shirts and little turtlenecks. And he is just very much into swagger and funny jokes. You asked him, what are you? Are you Reagan? Are you the next Reagan? And he says, I am Zelensky. He's very funny. But if you ask him tough questions, he gets very defensive. He's like, what? What do you mean, bro? What do you mean, huh? He's psychologically very strong, it seems. And he has advisors around him, and it's not certain how much he listens to them or how he actually makes the decision-making process, how it operates. I'm not sure. He seems to be very independent and very tough-minded and very macho.
Does the buck stop with him? Is he the executive? He's the guy making this decision, or is he somebody that's going to hand over? Is he going to be a Bush with a Dick Cheney behind him, basically running the show, or is he going to be a Trump where he's the boss?
So it's well known that he was heavily backed by Mr. Kolomoisky, one of the aforementioned Jewish oligarchs of Ukraine, which Ukrainians are very tolerant about and tolerate. A very, very funny, trollish, amoral, ruthless character.
Who had an actual Shark Tank in his office.
Yes, I've written about the Shark Tank. The Shark Tank is real.
And just to give some background on Kolomoisky, what makes him such a colorful character is when Ukraine's military was decimated and Russia invades, Kolomoisky essentially took all these volunteer soldiers who fought in the square in Kiev in the revolution and basically built himself a private army.
He equipped them, he armed them, he trained them. He was spending to the tune of $10-12 million a month to have a private army, which is at that point one of the biggest private armies in the world, and it was a very big private army indeed, and they did a lot of the fighting. So he saved large chunks of Ukraine from falling to the Russians in 2014 and 15, for which he should be commended, and that we should acknowledge that. He then went on to do some very, very shady things and tried to take some buildings by force in the middle of Kiev when some subsidies that he had been milking from the national oil company were being shut off to him. He didn't like that, and he used force, and President Poroshenko banished him from the country in 2015. He fled to Switzerland and Israel. He has like 3 passports, one of them being Ukrainian. He plotted his revenge, and part of his revenge was to put a Jewish comedian on his television station with a show about him being the president. And 4 years later, that paid dividends, with that comedian becoming president and bringing Mr. Kolomoisky and his people along for the ride. So many people around Mr. Zelensky are Kolomoisky friends, lawyers, fixers, professionals. The main apparat, the internal apparat of the presidential administration was run by Mr. Kolomoisky's guys, simply because Zelensky didn't have enough people. So Mr. Kolomoisky is based on my conversations with people in Ukraine who know these things, is one of the 5 guys that decides things within the inner ring around Mr. Zelensky. Now, if Mr. Zelensky, who's now in power, will be able to say, I'm my own man now, which has often happened before when an oligarch has brought a politician to power. Same thing happened with Mr. Yanukovych. Mr. Akhmetov and the Donbas clans picked Mr. Yanukovych to be their man. They never thought that he would be quite as corrupt or quite as willful as he was. So that a certain oligarch brings you to power doesn't mean he can control you after you're in power. That is the interesting question. How much power Mr. Kolomoisky and his friends and other shareholders, and I do think of it as a shareholder agreement, will have over Mr. Zelensky.
The guy's really a blank slate. He's still staffing up right now, and there's going to be the usual power struggles going on with everybody trying to get a job in his government. What is your prediction on how that process is going to go?
I've been in Kiev a lot, trying to keep track of it. I have a good relationship with Mr. Daniluk, the former finance minister, who is hoping to be the next foreign minister of Ukraine. If Mr. Daniluk does become foreign minister and other Western educated reformers do get big jobs in this administration, we will know what this administration is going to be like. Since he's extremely untested and inexperienced, the presidential chief of staff will be a de facto prime minister in this government. So if Mr. Kolomoisky gets his own guy appointed as the chief of staff, that shows what this government's about. If it's someone else, it's not Kolomoisky's appointee as the chief of staff, we know that this is a more independent government. So there's 3 or 4 groups of people fighting for power around Mr. Zelensky now, and he's listening to different people all the time, and he's trying to figure out what kind of guy he wants to be. Is it his childhood friends? Is it his business partners? Is it reformers? Is it...
Oh God, Putin did childhood friends.
Yeah, that's typically what you do when you come to power, is you put your childhood friends into positions of power and make them rich. That's how you build a kleptocracy. So I hope that does not happen in Ukraine. We have high expectations for this gentleman. He has a huge mandate. It's going to be very difficult for him because he has a very difficult situation in front of him. He has a very tough opponent. He has a divided parliament. He has shark-like opponents. He has allies who literally own shark tanks. He has a very difficult situation ahead of him. I wish him the best of luck. We can only hope for the best.
I was very clear in my comments to Newsweek where I said there's no pro-Kremlin candidate in this race, which is absolutely true. But there have been accusations, which I've seen with like some Ukraine watchers, pointing to all sorts of reasons that they argued that Zelensky just was the pro-Kremlin candidate. And there was an interesting thread produced by one security expert on Twitter saying that there were some hacked emails that revealed that Russia had a strategy in place to try to get a comic elected president of Ukraine, to try to discredit Ukraine. And there was rumors or so forth of money going from Kremlin sources to Zelensky. What is your comment on any sort of vulnerability he might have for the Kremlin, either directly, indirectly? Do you see anything there?
Do I think he's a Manchurian candidate for the Russians? No. Do I think he was put in place by a master plan from 2014 by the Russians? A masterful plan? No, I do not. Do I think he is going to try to reframe negotiations in a way that is less antagonistic in the way that Poroshenko was? Probably yes. Will he capitulate to the Russians? Probably not, or not immediately. In any case, it'll be very difficult in the Ukrainian political atmosphere as it is. Do I think he comes from the Russian-speaking part of the country, and having spent formative years doing business and hanging out in Moscow, does he have a kind of a relationship to the Russians? Is his culture more Russian than Ukrainian? Yeah. What does that actually mean? It could play out in many, many different ways. The first thing that the Russians did immediately upon him winning was to throw an assault on him symbolically with a passportization campaign of people in eastern Ukraine, and he responded quite belligerently and almost viciously.
No, I thought he was funny. I thought he did what we say on Twitter. He clapped back. He was like, hey, well, basically saying, like, how much is that passport in Russia worth, given that it's essentially a dictatorship? Like, he called them out.
Yeah, he did. He reacted in a very funny and masterful way. He passed that test with flying colors, I would say. The Russians are very tough opponents, and they're very, very aggressive opponents. Immediately upon him winning, they threw him a test to see how aggressive he was, to see what tactics they could use. And he responded in an aggressive and funny posture, which also proved to the Russians that he's going to be a difficult character. You have to understand, he will be able to communicate because he's a Russian speaker and he speaks their language in every sense. In every sense, he speaks their language. He'll be able to communicate directly to Russian speakers in Belarus, in Russia, in Kazakhstan, from a liberal democratic standpoint in a way that the Ukrainians never could have. He is a direct threat to the Kremlin. They heard loud and clear what he said on election night. The first thing he said upon being elected was, people of a post-Soviet Union, look at us here. Anything can happen. The debates between him and President Poroshenko were watched by millions of Russian speakers in Russia, Kazakhstan, and Belarus. He speaks directly over the heads of the Kremlin to Russians. He has a huge following in Russia. People watch what he says, and they can listen without a translator. You know, Poroshenko made his speeches in Ukrainian, and he was seen as the enemy, at the very least, not a friend, if not an enemy, as a Ukrainian nationalist. This guy is a threat because he can speak directly to the Russian people in a way that no Ukrainian politician has in the last 5 years. He's a total threat to the Kremlin, to their message.
Hear me out. You walk into a store and you immediately find exactly what you're looking for. You try it on and it looks perfect. Well, that's basically the feeling you get every time you shop at Movement Watches. That's MVMT Watches. Our friends at Movement have you covered with tons of quality, clean, and all-around good-looking watches and accessories that we can actually afford and order right from our couch. They're one of the fastest-growing watch companies in the world because of their iconic minimalist designs. They believe that no one should have to overpay for great style, so they're always coming out with new fashion-forward designs for you. They've sold over 2 million watches across more than 160 countries, and their collections are always expanding. I just ordered one myself, and I'm glad to have something nice to wear on my wrist that also allows me to leave my cell phone behind and not use that thing as a watch anymore. It's time for real watches to have a comeback. Movement watches start at just $95, so you're guaranteed to find something you love that won't break your bank. Get 15% off today with free shipping and free returns by going to movement.com/gaslit. See why Movement keeps growing. Check out their expanding collection. Go to mvmt.com/gaslit. Join the movement.
And that matters also on the big war front of social media, where we have seen Ukraine's Twitter account actually fight with a Russian government Twitter account. So when the Russians are actually creating internet trolls to troll their enemies, here you have a stand-up comic who is going to troll the shit out of them.
Yes, you troll us, we will elect to our presidency a masterful troll who will out-troll you, sir.
That's what we have to look forward to, a lot of Twitter wars between Russia and Ukraine.
This literally is where Western democracy is going. There was an article today about the showrunner of The Servant of a People. They just franchised to 15 other countries the Ukrainian TV show Servant of a People. There will be 15 other countries now where the president will be played by an actor on TV. 5 years from now, if statistics hold, maybe a third of them will be presidents of those countries. There's no going back. Social media and the collapse of the old media structures, of the old media to social media, there's no going back to that. This is the new world, and the Ukrainians are yet again at the forefront of the war and of the new techniques of media warfare.
Do you know what's really hilarious? So you cannot buy soft power like that, having the president of Ukraine on a Netflix series that's getting licensed to countries around the world. Like, that is some like really useful soft power for Ukraine. And we were talking about Obama's foreign policy earlier. Richard Stengel, who served in the Obama White House, focused on foreign policy, he actually had a strategy where he went to Hollywood to try to get Hollywood to create some films and try to create some sort of like entertainment soft power operation to fight the Kremlin, which I really think was more Richard Stengel just wanting to go to Hollywood and have lunch. And so here you have the Ukrainians just naturally, organically doing that. So we are going to wrap this up. And so, Vlad, just to end as we started, given where we are now, what is your sort of outlook on how successful Giuliani could potentially be in trying to dig up dirt against Trump's opponents out of Ukraine? I mean, it is a country, yes, they've made some progress in corruption, but it is a very corrupt country. I think it's something, it ranks like 130 on the transparency index, or maybe it's gone up 10 points.
It's gone up 10 points, but I think it's still like 120th first or something. I mean, it was 137th and it's got up 10 points or something. It's still pretty bad.
It's still pretty bad. So will Giuliani be able to show up to his friends in Ukraine and Kharkiv with a bag of cash or whatever, or some promises, and get evidence invented or get investigations open to strengthen his claims to try to stir up investigations here in the U.S.? What sort of potential do you think is there?
Can Giuliani ask the prosecutor general, whoever it be, to open up cases against particular Americans? I don't think this administration in Ukraine will be quite as limpid as the last on that question. The Ukrainians certainly did not cooperate with the Mueller investigation, as far as I know, because it was not in their best interest. They've been horrified for the last 3 years of what happened, with Donald Trump tweeting about them, and rightly or wrongly, mostly wrongly, thinking that the Ukrainian government came after him. Certain people like Mr. Leshenko and one part of the Ukrainian government did leak things about Paul Manafort, which would have come out anyway, and in that way you could say got involved in American partisan politics. That's true. Can you say that President Poroshenko greenlighted that? You'd have to give me proof. I haven't seen any evidence of that. Ukraine is a chaotic place, and certain people did leak stuff about Paul Manafort, who was a horrible human being and did horrible things in both Ukraine and the rest of the world on behalf of what he thought was the greater good of himself and America. Can Giuliani go and find more bad things like that? He can construe things which don't look great in really conspiratorial ways. And lots of people who do not have expertise on Russia, Ukraine, would look at that and say, oh, but, you know, did a lot of corrupt stuff happen in Ukraine, which is difficult for me as a Ukraine expert to explain to Americans, oh, these are coincidences, which a really partisan person who's also making money by the hundreds of thousands in Ukraine is using against his political opponents? Yes.
That makes sense. Thank you so much for your coverage today and providing Ukraine 101. And I'm sure Ukraine is going to stay in the news here in the States. And I hope that our discussion will give people a clearer picture to read through the bad articles, the bad tweets, the bad takes as this all develops.
Thank you again for having me. It's been lovely and always lovely talking to you, as you know.
Gaslit Nation is produced by Andrea Chalupa and Sarah Kenzier. If you like what we do, leave us a review on iTunes. It helps us reach more listeners. And check out our Patreon. It helps keep us going. Our editor for this was Carlin Daigle. Original music in Gaslit Nation is produced by David Whitehead, Martin Vissenberg, Nick Farr, Damian Arriaga, and Carlin Daigle. Our phenomenal logo was designed by the genius that is Hamish Smith at the New York-based design firm Order. Thank you so much, Hamish. Gaslit Nation would like to thank our supporters at the producer level on Patreon: Solomon Hikes, Alan Liu, David Porter, Paige Harrington, Adam Levine, Alexandria Lane Detweiler, Leonard Guzman, Henri Duchamp, Jared Lombardo, Jason Bainbridge, Jody DeWitt, John Ripley, Kate Cotton, Kelly Ranson, Kevin M. Garnett, Lorraine W. Todd, Tanya Chalupa, my mother, Terry Brady, Zachary Lemon, Ann Marshall, Michael Balin, Brian DeHuden, Carolyn Friend, Catherine Anderson Karina, Kathy Kavanaugh, Diana Gallagher, D.L. Singfield, Doug Friedenberg, Eric Kaplan, Arena Guardia, Ethan Mann, George Hughes, Gustav Hausby, James Tolley, Jason Rita, Jennifer Slavic, Jans Elstrup Rasmussen, John Dambro, John Keane, Kinchiro Nakagawa, Kevin Christie, Kim Mellon, Christy Vitale, Larry Colwell, Lawrence Graham, Luke Stranded, Margaret Moe, Matt Perez, Matthew Copeland, Maureen Murphy, Michelle Dash, Mike Tripico, Nicole Spear, Rhonda White, Rich Craw, Sonia Bogdanovic, Ted Gary Mitchell, Thomas Burns, Victoria Olson, Zach Rousdower, and Hollis Ramsey. Thank you all so much. We could not make this show without you. To deal with these abnormal times that we find ourselves in, we here at Gaslit Nation take a strong stance of saying no to savior syndrome. The only thing that's going to get us out of this is self-reliance and holding our leaders accountable. And the only power we have left that we can rely on is grassroots power. To illustrate our point, here's Share, providing a useful metaphor for these times. Rely on no one but your own hard work and dedication. That's the only way out of this. Awaken your inner Share.
You said a man is not a necessity, a man is a luxury.
Like dessert. Yeah. A man is absolutely not a necessity.
Did you mean that to sound mean and bitter?
Oh, not at all. I adore dessert. I love men. I think men are the coolest. But you don't really need them to live. My mom said to me, you know, sweetheart, one day you should settle down and marry a rich man. And I said, Mom, I am a rich man.
Welcome to the Gaslit Nation Action Guide, available on our website, gaslitnationpod.com. Democracy is a lifestyle. Trump is a symptom of the corruption, institutional failure, and indifference that we can no longer tolerate.
Okay, so number one, get a guide. Stride Toward Freedom, the Montgomery Story by Martin Luther King Jr. is an essential guide to self-management, managing others, and building teams. This inspirational case study of resistance, written by a young MLK after successfully leading the Montgomery bus boycott, shows how smart organization took on the authoritarianism of the Jim Crow South. Never forget that MLK was considered a radical in his day, even though there's nothing radical about demanding human rights and dignity. Today, the same remains true. It's not radical or socialist to demand that corporations stop polluting for profits and to call for an end to tax breaks, like for sending jobs overseas, that worsen the income inequality crisis. To help communicate these urgent issues, another essential guide is the all-new Don't Think of an Elephant, Know Your Values, and Frame the Debate by George Lakoff.
Number 2 of the Gaslit Nation Action Guide, focus on state races. States decide key quality of life issues, and local candidates help drive votes up ballot for federal races. Every District and Future Now are two excellent groups working to build a progressive infrastructure and turn states blue from the bottom up. Get involved by donating what you can, or join or start your own group with their help in your state. We provide on our Action Guide interviews with every district and Future Now. For more background.
Number 3, join. Grassroots power is one of the strongest forms of power we have left in America, especially with Mitch McConnell and Trump packing the courts. Don't succumb to savior syndrome by expecting Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or whomever else you admire to do all the work. Representatives are human and need our help. Fulfill the far-right's worst nightmare by creating generations of AOCs by helping build a more progressive union. Join a local group from any of these great national organizations for important action alerts like demonstrations or getting out the vote. Indivisible, Swing Left, Sister District, Move On, Flippable.
Number 4, fight global warming. Sunrise Movement is a grassroots organization demanding a Green New Deal. There are a lot of other groups working to adopt urgently needed green initiatives. C40 Cities connects cities around the world committed to taking climate action. 350.org helps activists rise to the challenge of the climate crisis. And there are more trusted organizations that need our support, linked to on our action guide.
Number 5, unionize. In the age of Trump, there should be no more fear of starting or joining a union. Just tell your boss that you saw how unions protected workers during the universally unpopular Trump shutdown. Fight for 15 and its local variants are working to ensure a fair wage and strengthen unions in the service sector. Don't know how to get started? Read Organizing to Win, new research on union strategies, and No Shortcuts, Organizing for Power in the New Gilded Age, both of which are linked to on the Gaslit Nation website.
Number 6, run for something. There are a lot of great groups out there that demystify the process of becoming a candidate and running a campaign. Run for Something is one of our favorites. There's even a book to help you get started. Run for Something, a real talk guide to fixing the system yourself by Amanda Littman. If you believe in facts and science and are a compassionate human being, you need to run for something and recruit others to as well. Even if it's a long shot, you can still create urgent conversations and treat your campaign like a platform for discussions you care about, helping bring together like-minded people to work for change even long past the election. Just look at what a refreshing discovery long-shot Mayor Pete has been and all the great work Andrew Gillum continues to do to register 1 million voters in Florida.
Number 7, protect the vote. Every District Action Fund just launched a, quote, report card identifying states with enough progressive support in local governments to push through important voting reforms like automatic registration and the abolishment of racist voter ID laws. Is your state on the list? You can click a link and find out. If so, every District Action Fund empowers you to help your state reach the gold standard of voting. Concerned about vote hacking and Ivanka Trump branded voting machines? Yes, that is a thing. Secure Our Vote provides background information and other resources to take action. Other groups to check out are Spread the Vote, Let America Vote, and Project ID, which help people get the information they need to register, vote, and get an ID. And again, these are linked to on our site.
Number 8. Launch ballot initiatives and laws. Why not launch a ballot initiative? Kate Fahey turned her Facebook post into the movement Voters Not Politicians to end gerrymandering in Michigan. It passed overwhelmingly. We have a link on our action guide for you to read more of her story. Or you could build a grassroots coalition to get a law passed in your state. In our episode, How to Pass a Law, I interview my mother about how she, while pregnant with me and a young mother already, without any political experience, mobilized a grassroots army to pass the child car seat law in California. Yes, it can be done.
Number 9, end terrorism in America. Moms Demand works to elect candidates and lobby for sensible legislation to stop the gun violence epidemic driven by the blood money gun lobby, the NRA. Southern Poverty Law Center exposes white supremacy, a leading terrorist movement in America. To help immigrant communities deliberately terrorized by Trump's cruel border policies, we have a list linked here of groups that you can support.
Number 10, make art. To say that art cannot make a difference stems from a tone-deaf attitude of privilege. Ukraine's Euromaidan revolution of 2013 to 2014 relied on art and artists of all kinds to sustain protesters living in Arctic cold temperatures and under the threat of government-sanctioned violence. North Korean dissident Yeonmi Park said that Orwell's Animal Farm helped her heal after escaping the cult-like dictatorship. And in our episode, The Blue Wave Continues, Kansas Rising, we share Davis Hammett's account of how painting a rainbow house created a ripple effect in Kansas, leading to major electoral victories. We need the artists and storytellers of all kinds more than ever.
So this is not a comprehensive list of suggestions on how you can create a more progressive America and stop entrenched corruption. There are many paths you can take, and we encourage you to think for yourself and to work together. There is no one solution. Whether you're in a blue state or a red state, these ideas apply to you. Do not take any of the freedoms you have left for granted. Never underestimate the power of hard work. Additionally, we have a reading list linked to from there because it's essential to read widely to understand how we got here and the best ways to navigate the challenges of the 21st century. So again, all of this is available on our site, gaslitnationpod.com.